History as it happens, August 10th, 2023. Florida's slavery lesson.
Right here in Florida, they plan to teach students that enslaved people benefited from slavery. They insult us in an attempt to gaslight us.
I didn't do it, and I wasn't involved in it, but I think what they're doing is I think that they're probably going to show some of the folks that eventually parlayed, being a blacksmith into doing things later in life. But the reality is all of that is rooted in whatever is factual. They listed everything out. And if you have any questions about it, just ask the Department of Education. You can talk about those folks. But I mean, these were scholars who put that together.
One sentence in a social studies curriculum on African American history K through 12 in Florida caused an uproar. Many liberals and some Republicans running for president condemned what they say distorts the past in the service of a right-wing political agenda. But maybe all sides here are missing what's really wrong with Florida's new education standards. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
I would say the central issue is skills. The key word is skills. Then the question is, what kind of skills did which slaves have, where, and when did they acquire them? And you could develop a typology of skills acquired in Africa prior to transportation across the Middle Passage.
Go to page 6 of Florida's State Academic Standards for Social Studies. This is the section for African American history. And check out item number 2.3 for the middle school curriculum. It says, examine the various duties and trades performed by slaves. For example, agricultural work, painting, carpentry, tailoring, domestic service, blacksmithing, transportation. Benchmark clarification number 1 says instruction includes how slaves develop skills which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit. Now, out of nearly 200 items, this one sentence ignited a political uproar. Vice President Kamala Harris went to an African Methodist Episcopal church in Orlando to publicly chastise Florida, whose Republican governor happens to be running for president.
Right here in Florida, they plan to teach students that enslaved people benefited from slavery. They insult us in an attempt to gaslight us, in an attempt to divide and distract our nation with unnecessary debates. And now they attempt to legitimize these unnecessary debates with a proposal that most recently came in of a politically motivated roundtable. Well, I'm here in Florida, and I will tell you there is no roundtable, no lecture, no invitation we will accept to debate an undeniable fact. There were no redeeming qualities of slavery.
Governor Ron DeSantis did challenge Harris to a debate about the new curriculum. She turned him down, as you heard there. DeSantis gave an online interview to NBC's Meet the Press Now, where he defended the new standards.
So that means they developed skills in spite of slavery, not because of slavery. It was them showing resourcefulness and then using those skills.
Did enslaved people develop skills that could personally benefit them? Well, in a statement to defend that sentence, 2 of the standards authors, including William Allen, who we'll hear more from in a minute, released a list of individuals, but they did themselves no favors because, as some historians pointed out, about half of those people were never enslaved or they didn't gain the skills through their enslavement. But that embarrassing mistake aside, the way people are responding to this controversy does seem to be conditioned by their politics. People on the left are ridiculing it, people on the right are defending Florida. And that includes, as mentioned, William Allen, a conservative political scientist. He was one of the 13 members of the work group, and here he is in an interview on WPLG Local 10 in Miami.
Well, Ms. Milberg, I could accept one modification. And that is a modification that referred to personal and community or social benefits. Because, of course, it wasn't just the individuals who benefited, but this entire nation ultimately benefited from it. And that could have been expanded. But anything that would deny benefit deriving from human exertion, even under the extreme conditions of oppression, would be false, and it would be dehumanizing. The idea that you should not speak of people making whatever utilities they could in the circumstances in which they found themselves to their own use and benefit is dehumanizing. You might as well say they aren't capable of doing anything.
Well, now I'm going to share some scholarship from Many Thousands Gone by Ira Berlin. The chapter is The Tobacco Revolution in the Chesapeake, page 136. Changes in the structure of the labor force resonated outside the plantation. The need for urban labor also created a market for hirelings, and the advent of mixed agriculture, with its peculiar seasonal rhythms, encouraged rural slaveholders to rent their slaves during slack time. Unlike those confined to the plantation, hired slaves generally worked independently outside the direction of an owner or overseer. Control over their time also allowed hired slaves expanded opportunities to pursue their own interests. Some hired themselves to do odd jobs, earning cash or receiving payment for overwork. The general acceptance of jobbing opened the door for slaves to travel freely, live on their own, and enjoy a measure of independence not possible in the rural plantation regimen. Self-hire and overwork payment marked the expansion of the slave's economy in a new guise. The Chesapeake remained preeminently an allowance society, with slaveholders doling out rations and clothing. Slaves believed themselves entitled to their allowance and demanded what they understood to be their due. When customary levies of blankets, clothing, and food were not forthcoming, they protested, often vigorously. However, slaves with access to cash were not satisfied with their owners' allotments. They pressed for what Jefferson called their peculium. Slaves enlarged their gardens and flocks of chickens, ducks, and geese, working the little spots allowed them with great intensity. Occasionally, they kept a pig or two. In the region's foundries and forges, overwork payments became a regular practice, and skilled slaves established substantial accounts. Slaves expanded their market, selling their labor to non-slaveholders and others. John Harrower, a plantation-based tutor, hired a slave woman as a spinner. Harrower's slave employee worked for him at nights and on Sunday, allowing Harrower to set up a small enterprise of his own and giving his slave subcontractor a small income. The proceeds of their independent production permitted slaves to enrich their family's diet and expand their wardrobes. Thank you for letting me read some of Ira Berlin's classic Many Thousands Gone. Now, no sane person would suggest the late Ira Berlin ignored the horrors of slavery, or that what I just read to you somehow transcends the fundamental injustice and immorality of human chattel slavery. No matter what a slave managed to do, he or she was still enslaved for life, barring manumission or escape, and their children would be enslaved for life. So this one sentence causing an uproar isn't very important compared to real problems with the Florida standards, as many professional educators have pointed out, and as some historians with whom I've consulted for this podcast have argued. The African American history standards mostly ignore the centrality of property rights in enslavement. The word chattel doesn't appear once. And this omission is important because the defense of property rights was the first line of defense for the pro-slavery side, as one historian puts it. Now, why might the authors of a curriculum that takes a generally positive view of property rights in American history want to downplay this connection? Is it ideology? Also, race and racism, while not ignored in the curriculum, are, in the view of some critics, not emphasized enough. You won't find much about the tenets of pro-slavery ideology. And will teachers feel free to talk about racial slavery in a state with a Stop Woke Act? Bob Hall is a professor emeritus of African American Studies and History at Northeastern University. In his long career, his articles and essays have appeared in major academic journals and anthologies. And he is the author of Do Lord Remember Me: Religion and the Forging of African American Culture in Florida. Bob Hall, hello, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So before we launch into the Florida uproar, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, because you've been working on this subject for decades.
Well, first of all, I'm from Florida, from Tallahassee, born and raised under Jim Crow segregation until age 14. And Leon County, the county in which the capital city is located, was in 1860 the seventh largest cotton producing county in the South. So there are people that I grew up with who are descended from folk who were slaves, often in that very county. And the population was majority Black in that county, Leon County, until probably the mid 1930s. So the signs of slavery were all around us as I grew up. And that's the beginning of the fascination. Now, when I graduated from Harvard and came back home to begin graduate studies at the Florida State University, that is the Seminoles, not the Gators, I was one of the earliest African American graduate students to pursue a PhD in history at Florida State University.
And this is in the early 1970s, right?
1969.
Wow, okay.
5 days after graduating from college. And Florida State University had a remarkably respectable, to some surprisingly respectable, core of historians who devoted some of their attention to slavery, Reconstruction, and other aspects of African American history, often focusing on Florida itself. So I started out as a student of Reconstruction under Joe M. Richardson, who did a book on the Negro and the Reconstruction of Florida. But as I was proceeding in graduate studies, a veritable revolution in the study of slavery was happening all around me. This is the early 1970s. This is the era of the big blockbuster synthetic books like Herbert Gutman's The Black Family and Slavery and Freedom, Eugene Genovese, Roll Jordan Roll, etc. It was also a time in 1972 when the WPA slave narratives were published. Now, they were collected as part of New Deal Federal Writers Program, but they lay fallow on the shelves of the Library of Congress in typescript, often ignored by people who were trying to reconstruct the history of slavery. But they were published in 1972 in facsimile reprint editions, 17 or 18 volumes. And so I just went crazy. And I was sucked back in time to the slavery period. I had not started out intending to be primarily a student of slavery. 70s go by, 80s go by, I still haven't finished my work. Meanwhile, the revolution in slavery studies is growing. And I ended up deciding to go back to something of a beginning, not, back to creation, but back to the arrival of the earliest Africans to set foot on what is now Florida.
And that's well before 1619, right?
Well before, which is one of my major reservations or critiques, if you would, of the 1619 project. It's not in and of itself an objectionable project. The essays in the book version are quite astoundingly good. But to start African American history at 1619, as one of the members of the working group in Florida does in a book that she co-authored, Ms. Rice, is at 1619, is to my taste, too Anglo-centric.
Yeah.
This is not a critique of Eurocentrism, but specifically Anglo, as distinguished from Dutch and French and Danish, all of whom were involved in the slave trade and had colonies in the Western Hemisphere. I would start the story, if you're just focusing on what became Florida, back to the 1520s.
Wow. That was a Spanish colony, right? And let me ask you a
Right.
question about how you arrived at grad school, late 60s, early 70s. The revolution in slavery studies was underway. Were you also among the scholars who were overturning the Dunning School on Reconstruction, or had that already been overturned?
I think that my dissertation supervisor is more of the generation that was overturning the Dunning School.
Okay.
Now, he's from Missouri. He did his PhD at Florida State University. He was supervised in turn by Weymouth Tyree Jordan, who wrote about Southern plantation stuff. But the Dunning School was pretty much a dead issue by the time I got to graduate school. Yeah.
So the Florida curriculum says, quote, instruction includes how slaves develop skills which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit. This is one sentence out of about 190 bullet points, if you will, in the K through 12 curriculum on African American studies in Florida. Vice President Harris went to Florida and said this: yesterday in the state of Florida, they decided middle school students will be taught that enslaved people benefited from slavery. Well, that's not a literal translation of what the curriculum says, but I guess some folks are saying that's what it implies. Bob Hall, what's your take on this one sentence that is causing an uproar?
Well, it's as Dr. Allen, who was one of the members of the working group,
William
would
Allen.
say, let's provide some context. This is William Barkley Allen, who's from Fernandina Beach, Florida, originally, and apparently has retired there, or at least has maintained political ties there, mediated mainly through the Republican Party. But in any case, I would say the central issue is skills. The key word is skills. Then the question is, what kind of skills did which slaves have, where, and when did they acquire them? And you could develop a typology of skills acquired in Africa prior to transportation across the Middle Passage. You could say skills acquired in the West Indies prior to reshipping or transfer to North America. You could say skills acquired under slavery as slaves. You could say skills acquired post-slavery, and so on. And then there's another interesting thing, is that in the immediate post-slavery era, some of those slaves who had acquired artisanal skills were actually driven from those occupations by white Southerners who were basically displacing them in cities, particularly in the South, because most Black folk remained in the South and in the rural South at that, until 1910.
In some cases, the slave master was allowing his enslaved person, his property, to learn a skill so he wouldn't have to hire paid help who knew how to do the same thing, right?
Right. And sometimes, the economic interest that slaveholders had sometimes meant if a worker was doing something truly dangerous on a farm or plantation, the expendable life from an economic point of view was the white worker. Way above the ground, posed life threat to their valuable slave property. That would be a circumstance in which a non-slave white might be hired. But otherwise, particularly larger planters, tried to establish as much self-sufficiency as they could. Meant that they sometimes did, I wouldn't say permit, but arrange and perhaps even require certain slaves to learn to become blacksmiths and so on and so forth. Now, some of the people who were brought from Africa were blacksmiths in Africa. Some of the people who were brought from Africa were already experienced in agriculture. And in fact, some of the people, to the extent that there were ethnic preferences, some of the preferences for origins in Africa flowed from the perception that certain ethnic population was already skilled in certain trades, skilled in cultivating indigo, skilled in cultivating submerged or wet rice, skilled in agriculture on the whole.
You can read that sentence and, it's accurate, as you've just been discussing. Slaves did develop skills, which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit. But I guess what some critics are saying is, the people behind these standards, you mentioned William Allen, they seem to have a desire to make slavery sound not as bad as it actually was. But when you look at the entire list in the curriculum, I'm not sure that's what's happening here either. I just think this is maybe an awkwardly worded sentence that can be taught in many different ways, as you just explained.
Well, I would say now I'm lifting my eyes from the topic of slavery and from the slavery era for a moment,
Sure.
And saying that there's a tone that runs throughout the whole thing, that the Harvard historical sociologist, Orlando Patterson, refers to as contributionism. Contributionism and catastrophism, both of those can be either conservative in their political implications or not.
Contributionism.
Contributionism is a kind of Me Tooism. Okay. Me Too. There's some ethnic groups, not just Black folk, who want to say, I was there too. We were there too. Me Too is part of American history. Or we talk about the achievement and the contributions to the exclusion of other things. Now, I would say that getting down in the weeds in the curriculum, there's unobjectionable things in there. What I find unique is that, as I mentioned to you in a prior conversation, the state of Massachusetts has never even attempted to have social studies standards of the type that Florida has, because the whole enterprise is so politically loaded that it blew up in people's faces and they said, just forget it. We'll just deal with math and English language arts.
And these history wars are not
at least Florida is trying to deal with that. Now, they're not dealing with it with very much skill. And I think that it's the political aspect of it. The two people who responded defending the standards once they were adopted on July the 16th or whenever were the two Black members of the supposed 13 that were members of this working group.
Yeah, you mentioned William Allen. He's given a number of interviews defending the standards.
Yeah, defending them and attacking Kamala Harris for being political. But, it's a pot calling a kettle black. All of these parties are being political in this political time, in this presidential election cycle.
And, your answers to these first couple questions are a reminder that when we're talking about slavery, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to generalize. When are we talking about? Where are we talking about?
Right.
Which tasks are we talking about? Slavery developed differently in different parts of the country at different times. I'm holding Ira Berlin's classic book right here, Many Thousands Gone. And I'll just make one final point about this one sentence, because I want to move on to what I think are more important issues dealing with the Florida curriculum. I have his chapter open about the emergence of Atlantic Creoles in the Chesapeake. So this is the mid-1600s. He's talking about independent economic activities of the enslaved people there. He says they expanded during the middle years of the century, taking a multiplicity of forms as the Chesapeake's economy grew. Some slaves turned to handicrafts. Shoemaking and carpentering seemed the favored trades to complement agricultural production. Slave owners grew pretty angry and annoyed at the slaves, as Berlin calls it, their independent economic activities, and some of them used the money they earned from these activities to purchase their freedom, and they formed the first free black communities in that part of the country. So, again, this one sentence is, you can construe it in a number of different ways. It's not the worst part of what we're going to talk about.
There's a pendulum that has swung in slavery studies. In the early 70s, when I talk about the revolution in slavery studies, the model product was the big synthetic blockbuster book, which doesn't lend itself to the nuance that you are seeking, that we are seeking here, 50 years later. And the next phase of the revolution in slavery studies was kind of micro studies, microcosmic studies of slaves in a particular county, even microcosmic studies of slavery on a particular farm or plantation. And there are all kinds of relationships, human and economic, involved with slavery.
Yeah.
We often forget that the majority of pre-Civil War white Southerners owned 0 slaves.
And grew angry with the power of the slavocracy.
Right. So that's the question that students might want to ponder, is how could such a relatively small oligarchy of slave holders and those of the larger size holdings gain such a grip on the society that they were able to inspire, often coerce, non-slave owning whites into contributing to the maintenance of the slave system. So you had things like military-style draft at the local level, which required non-slave owning white males to devote a certain amount of service to helping the slaveholders capture their fugitive slaves. This is the so-called slave catching patrol, or paddy rollers, as the slaves call them. And then you had the kind of psychological incentives, the notion that, you might be dirt poor and white, but at least you're white.
Yeah, the racism comes into play there.
If you were on the paddy rollers and you captured somebody who had, as they used to say, stolen themselves, there's the property aspect, absconded with themselves. How can a person steal themselves unless that property relation is underscored?
Yeah, I think you hit it there. How do you get buy-in from the white majority who do not own any slaves? It was white freedom is based on black enslavement. And that's a powerful idea. So let's talk about what I think is, and I have to say I've been consulting with some other historians as well who've helped me get my mind wrapped around this issue, because it's an enormous issue. What I find to be the biggest problem with the Florida curriculum, and it's arguably the most important thing to know about slavery in North America, and that is the centrality of property rights. So here in the Florida curriculum, the word chattel in 216 pages does not appear a single time.
Did you do a word search?
I did.
Yeah.
Yes, that helps. The connection between enslavement and property is mentioned just a couple of times. For instance, Here's one sentence. In a section about how to evaluate conditions for Africans, how they changed in colonial North America between 1619 and 1776. Clarification number 3. Instruction includes how slave codes resulted in an enslaved person becoming property with no rights. That's one of the only mentions of it in the entire curriculum.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, the number one defense of enslavement was the property right.
Yeah, in the mid 70s, there was also another aspect of what I call the revolution in slavery studies was not introduction from scratch, but the beefing up of quantitative history. Its advocates sometimes being cute and making classical allusions referred to as cleometrics or cliometrics, Cleo being the Greek muse of history. And I have in mind here the economic historians, William Robert Fogel and Stanley Ingerman. Ingerman was a good friend of our family, but they did a book called Time on the Cross, published in 1974, in which they tried to get measurable data assessing things like the profitability of slavery and the efficiency of slave labor and so on. Now, the problem was that they were taking assertions made by abolitionists, pre-Civil War abolitionists, and then, sort of putting them to the quantitative test and saying, oh, we've exploded this balloon and punctured that balloon. But some of the things that they proclaimed to be new weren't all that new and have been insights that have been arrived at by the much maligned conventional, i.e. non-quantitative historians. But I never will forget, I was back at home in Tallahassee, going to graduate school at Florida State University, when Fogel and Ingerman's book, Time on the Cross, was published. And there was an article in the local Tallahassee newspaper. Local people referred to as the mullet wrapper or the fish wrapper was the Tallahassee Democrat. And the headline summarizing the findings of Fogel and Ingerman, and it's probably as much the predilections of the headline writer as anything else, says, scholars prove blacks thrived under slavery. This is 1974.
Oh my gosh. Scholars proved blacks thrived under slavery. Wow.
Right. So, and some of the other critics have said, this is like, people were saying that this is like racial algebra, rags to riches, upward occupational mobility within the context of slavery, as a retort to people who know that in the post-slavery era, particularly after the Great Migration, that rampant unemployment, differentially high for Black urban dwellers compared to white urban dwellers, was a major problem. They look back at the slavery days and say, during slavery days, you had 100% employment.
Yeah.
Deployment, maybe.
Yeah, and you could work 7 days a week if you want.
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
Yeah. And, without compensation, except for maybe a roof over your head and some rations. And in the colonial period, and even later, in the South Carolina and Georgia low country, when they were cultivating primarily rice, even the rations dispensed by the slave owners were niggardly, and the slaves had to use their own devices. They grew more African crops, they fished and hunted, and they grew what I call victory gardens, partly because if they had been dependent on the planter dispensed rations, they would have been even more malnourished than they were. There's another thing too, is that we live in a materialist society. And so we tend to judge the problems with slavery as being primarily in material terms. So what if you find a record or an incident, a document that says that a slave was dressed to the nines and drove a carriage with 6 white horses and had all that they wanted to eat? So does that mean slavery wasn't so bad after all? No. It means that they were slaves. They were, whatever they were doing without consent or contract. And if they had some privileges, those privileges could be yanked away from them at any moment.
Let's return, though, to the centrality of property rights with what you're saying right here. They were slaves, they were chattel, hereditary.
Right.
Now, this is just a curriculum. It might be taught differently depending on which teacher is teaching it in which classroom, although the critics of the curricula say that in DeSantis's Florida, there's a chilling effect on teachers who don't want to...
Well,
yeah,
there's
no mention
collateral
of
observations that suggest that it would have a chilling effect.
Yeah.
That is, when teachers are losing their jobs because of certain transgressions using certain books.
So, Bob, is it possible to really understand slavery in the United States without understanding the Chattel Principle?
No, I mean, I think we've established that. I think it does need to be. And I think all equally devastating is that it was property, the title to which could be transferred to one's heirs. You know, just like we, in my family, my mother was one of 13, and when my grandmother died, and the house that she lived in Charlottesville, Virginia, was referred to as heir property. Now here we're talking about real estate, but you did have the issue of when grandma dies, who gets the house? And you got 13 children quarreling over who's going to get the house or what portion of the proceeds from the sale of the house. The house often goes out of the family altogether. But in the case of pre-Civil War slavery, and I think it may also have something to do with what I call a Jay Leno stereotype about cousin marriages among white Southerners. You know, there's this old story that keep it in the family. I mean, and many former slaves during the slavery era and descendants of slaves during the present think that this kind of cross-cousin marriage, even quite removed, is downright incestuous. Whereas if you have property to transmit to your kin, including property in slaves, then there's a good deal more economic logic to close cousin marriages, which does seem to have been, more common among the slaveholding class in pre-Civil War South.
Well, I didn't know that. Interesting. So what do you think the left gets wrong about this debate we're having? For instance, somebody pointed out to me that by making it only about white supremacy, people on the left who make this argument,
Well, I don't think anybody's making the study of slavery only about white supremacy. The left, the concept of the left, the generic left, is about as unhelpful as the concept of the generic right. And what do people mean when they say the left? There's so many varieties of politics on the left. It's not a single party. At best, it's a tendency. In our current political context and for the last 5-6 years at least, you say left / communism / socialism. Those all get merged. I don't know what people mean when they say the left.
Well, I'll give you an example. The World Socialist website, which is very much on the left, was one of the leading critics of the 1619 Project.
Yes, I looked at that. Yeah, I looked at that.
Yeah, so because, it also rejects an interpretation of the past that is all about white supremacy, as they would put it. Although, of course, slavery in the United States was racial slavery, and that is made clear in the Florida curriculum to its credit. But when does that change happen, or when does that become solidified? Is it around the 1700s that American slavery is now what you would call racial slavery? Early 1700s?
I would say that it's the turning point, the fulcrum, if you focus on the Chesapeake, is about 1690s, 1698. And I saw a glimmer of this, not this chronological specification, but a glimmer of this recognition in the curriculum. And that is, prior to that, much of the labor supply in the Chesapeake tobacco cultivating areas was white European indentured servants who served out fixed, previously agreed upon terms of service, acquired their freedom, and often a grub stake in their new life. And for a while, it was not terribly expensive for people responsible for bringing in white indentured servants to do that. But there is what some economic historians call a price shock that spiked the cost of bringing in white indentured servants. At that point, that's when the shift and the acceleration of importing people directly from Africa came. And that was about the historian at Wake Forest, Anthony Parent, did a book that detailed this. And you can see in the Chesapeake that whether you look at Virginia or Maryland, that after a certain point, till the end of the legal slave trade, the overwhelming majority of Black newcomers arriving by shipping came in ships that had sailed directly from Africa with no stopover in the West Indies. Prior to, say, 1680s, 1690s, a significant portion of the Black newcomers to the Chesapeake had come via ships that had at least touched base in the West Indies. So in a way, the demand became robust enough that it was profitable for those involved in transporting slaves from Africa to bring a whole cargo to the Chesapeake. Whereas before that, maybe, the bulk of the cargo would go to Barbados, and a remnant of 4 or 5 out of several hundred would be held back by the captain, who was then going to take his sugarcane or molasses to Rhode Island or wherever, in case a few people wanted to buy a few slaves, there would be some left over. But for the Chesapeake and points south, once the demand became robust enough that those colonies could absorb entire cargoes shipped directly from Africa. From that point until each state, on a state-by-state basis, outlawed the participation of their citizens in the overseas slave trade, the overwhelming majority of Black newcomers came directly from Africa, which is kind of contrary to a previous conventional wisdom, which envisions the overwhelming majority of the ancestors of Black Americans coming via the West Indies after prolonged seasoning and cultural pulverizing in the West Indies. It all depends on what you count. If you count the number of ships arriving that had some slaves in them, then it would be ships from the West Indies. But, during the colonial period. But if you look at the average size of the cargo, the ships via the West Indies are bringing in, 3, 4, 9. Ships coming directly from the Congo or from the Gold Coast are bringing in hundreds. The different shipping points had different average cargo size. So the ships coming from the Congo and Angola are bringing in 500-600 people.
And around what time was this again? Years?
From, I would say, the late 1600s through 1770.
So I'll share with you one more observation before I ask my final question. One more observation that another historian shared with me about the Florida curriculum. The standards devote a good deal of time to abolitionism, but they largely reduce it to heroic personalities and ignore the consistent denial that slaves were either constitutionally or morally property. And there's almost nothing about pro-slavery ideology, which, this historian said, I suspect is the reason critics complain about the absence of racism in the standards, and that is also a very real problem.
Yeah, well, two things. One of the things that I have studied and published about is abolitionism. And again, the conventional, if you say, there was a time when if you say abolitionists and ask people, what is the phenotypic image of who an abolitionist was, the last thing that they would say would be a Black abolitionist. The abolitionists were well-meaning, moralistic whites, and there were such, who agitated against slavery, who helped the slaves escape through the Underground Railroad and so on. In the conventional wisdom, you would hardly be able to discern that there was such a thing as Black abolitionists.
Yeah, it was always a collaboration between whites and blacks.
Yeah. And often the Black folk, or maybe especially in the North, some of them had brothers that were still in what they call the prison house of bondage. Some of them had brothers or sisters or parents who had literally been kidnapped in the border states or in the North, but more often the border states. There was an interracial gang led by a white woman that went around in the border states kidnapping free blacks and shipping them south. So that's just one aspect. Now, what was the second?
Oh, I think the second aspect of that observation was the absence of racism in the standards.
Oh,
I mean, it's not completely absent, but...
Here's what I say, that the racism that had become part of the fabric of American society, concentrated in the South, but not confined to the South, grew from the sort of psychological and intellectual necessity to rationalize and justify slavery, right? And then it took on a life of its own. Now, the Marxists would say, superstructure. Once this thing had been launched, the mere end of slavery via the Civil War and the 13th Amendment was not sufficient to extinguish this whole elaborate mental infrastructure that, for shorthand, we call racism. And it still lingered, and it still guided and, to a certain extent, governed the future allocation of resources, which is why, in my view, if you entertain the notion of reparations, for example, then it should not be limited to reparations for slavery, because that ideation has continued to govern the allocation of resources in the United States, including educational resources. It's that ideation that has resulted in, say, my mother not being able to go beyond the 8th grade in Albemarle County when whites in the same county had a high school that they could go to. And that ideation accounts for the lag between the establishment of public white high schools in any given jurisdiction and the establishment of Black high schools in a jurisdiction. That ideation influences whether or not a jurisdiction decides that to abandon high school training for Blacks when some of them once had it and then abandoned. And the economic advantages that accrue to at least certain segments of the white population continue to accrue.
Yeah, I'm reminded of what's been said about the Homestead Act, which gave 1.5 million or so white families access to land, 6,000 black families compared to 1.5 million white families. So
Right.
I think Martin Luther King
Right.
pointed out that disparity as well.
Right.
So my final question to you, Bob Hall, is it seems, well, I'm frustrated. I don't know if you're frustrated, that for all the attention paid to this, we're still confused. We're still not getting to the heart of the matter.
Well, yeah, that's where the debate is. People don't agree on what the heart of the matter is.
Well, we have competing narratives. One coming from
part of it is that we as a country don't want to face up to the history of the country. We wish that we could just expunge it, clean slate, no recriminations, and let's just go forward from tomorrow morning on like everything is hunky-dory. But everything has a history. That doesn't mean that we are bound to it. But as James Baldwin would say that, if you don't know that history, you're not going to be able to escape it or overcome it or transcend it.
Yeah, I was going to say, and I know that when I say terms like left and right, competing narratives about this issue from the left and right both miss. And I don't think people have to pick between one or the other. There are historians such as yourself. There are libraries full of books about the history of enslavement in our country, where we don't have to subscribe to any politically driven, agenda-driven, well-marketed product.
I don't think that professional historians are intensely ideologically driven.
Well, I would agree with that. I'm referring to some of these other curricula, like the Hillsdale College curricula.
Oh, yeah. Well, Hillsdale College was mentioned in the background that I found on Mr. Allen, Dr. Allen. Hillsdale has, as you know, has a particular ideological bent. The enemy is the federal government. And so they don't accept any form of federal subsidy, aid, financial aid, any of that. And that allows them, they say, to be free and unfettered.
I should also point out that I've been very critical of the 1619 Project for doing this kind of thing from the other end of the political spectrum. And I guess my point is we don't need to just pick one or the other. There's an entire historiography available.
I think that the 1619 Project has, again, become a lightning rod, the likes of, if I may say so, Donald Trump when he was president, and the likes of Ron DeSantis, now that he's a presidential candidate, and possibly before that, delight in having the 1619 Project be a whipping boy, a proof of critical legal theory run amok, a proof of political correctness run amok. And what was President Trump's response to that was to create the 1776 Commission.
Now defunct, thankfully.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't recognize a single name of any of the putative scholars that were appointed. And most people wouldn't even accept being named to it. Now you mentioned the World Socialist website. Now, they drew upon some rather distinguished historians of early America and of the Civil War. I believe Gordon Wood of Brown University was one who took exception to the 1619 or some aspect of the 1619 Project. And James McPherson of Princeton took exception to it. I see a generational thing there. And I'm trying to be somewhat facetious and snide, but also somewhat analytical. And that is that these guys were elder statesmen. I mean, emeriti. And the developers of Project 1619 did not really consult with them. And I think that they interpreted that to mean that the developers were ignorant of their work or didn't respect their perspectives. But getting involved in that critique did not tarnish the reputations of either of those guys and others. Even, I think, Sean Woodlands.
He's been on my show many times. Yes, he's
of 1619.
I consider
Is that right?
Yeah, I consider Sean a friend. I think he's a great historian. And I mean, I think their criticisms focus primarily on a couple aspects of the project, not the entire thing. The Revolutionary War stuff was one of the points.
Yeah, well, you know, there's some who claim that, or who lean toward thinking that the whole teleological purpose of the American Revolution was to preserve slavery. I don't subscribe to that, but I do believe that an outcome of it was that of the revolution was that slavery was more secure after the Constitution making period than it had been before.
But not in the North.
No, not in the North, but slavery lasted in the North longer than many people think. It wasn't ended like flipping a light switch in the North. You know,
the slave owners fought the gradual emancipation bills that were passed, but that was significant. I mean, they attacked the Chattel Principle.
Yeah, it was. But with the Fugitive Slave Clause and the 3/5 Clause, that fastened political power of the slave-holding class on the entire nation, having the formula that enabled the slave-holding class to count not only the free white population in determining apportionment in Congress, but also counting 3/5 of the enslaved population who had no voice and no vote. And the slaveholding class essentially got to vote disproportionate to their numbers demographically.
It was like having slaves vote for slavery.
Yeah, or again, I say no voice and no vote, which you are right, is tantamount to, you know, by default to their demographic presence weighing in on behalf of slavery. Essentially, the Constitution made property sacrosanct, and it also included in that category property in human beings.
So let me ask you, did you read Sean Wilentz' book, No Property in Man?
No, I haven't.
Okay. Yeah, he takes on this whole issue. Well, I'll just say this, Bob Hall, thank you for your perspective. I enjoyed speaking to you for the first time here, and I hope you'll come back.
I will, and I'll send you some other people.
Well, that's a deal, because something tells me this won't be the last time I tackle the issue of slavery and our modern understanding. On the next episode of History as It Happens. Finally, I'm getting to my multi-part series on Oppenheimer, the book American Prometheus, the bomb and the historical issues it raises, the nuclear world we still live in. That's next as we report History as It Happens, podcast from the Washington Times.